one of the things that I've talked about in this podcast is how there's a tendency for like some subject areas to only focus on the content itself without actual application. Like for myself, math classes, I had no idea why I was learning pre-calc. Like it had absolutely no application in my life and has not had any application since I took it. If perhaps the teacher had actually said, here's when you're going to need to know this thing, then maybe I would have actually paid more attention in that class. But I mean, the same thing applies to like history classes, to science classes, etc. There's so much schooling that occurs that is completely decontextualized from actual real world application. And this is an idea that is often referred to as situated language and learning. And so we actually talk about that in episode 53, which was like well over 100 episodes ago, and is titled Situated Language and Learning with Brian Brown, which I highly recommend if you want to learn more about this concept. But if we are just focusing on like algorithms without actual application of when you might use those algorithms or how it impacts the world or the users who use them, then I would argue we probably aren't doing a great job of actually contextualizing or situating the understandings within real world application. But I haven't taught those style of classes, so maybe there's something that I'm missing here. This is just me kind of guessing, going off of the wide variety of classes I have actually taught. Now, to argue with myself, because I like to do this, having taught like band and drumline and things like that, those concepts and practices are applicable or situated within real-world context in terms of like, hey, the techniques that you're using right here, you could use on a gig or use for your leisure to perform, etc. But we don't necessarily talk about, well, how does this relate to ethics? Like I mentioned in prior podcasts, like there's a rosewood shortage, and rosewood is often used to be able to create instruments like marimbas that I played on as a percussionist. Should we spend time in lessons talking about the ethical implications of actually practicing an instrument that is causing some deforestation issues? Or should we spend that time just focusing on how to perform better on an instrument that uses the rosewood? So on one hand, I agree with the participants who say that ethics can be embedded in so many different ways. But on the other hand, I can think of some arguments where, okay, well, maybe it is situated, but it might not necessarily relate to ethics, which I'll actually unpack a little bit more in the lingering questions at the end of this podcast episode. If you want to listen to the full episode of this podcast, check out episode 182 of the CSK8 podcast on any podcast platform you listen to.